So, we're talking all about epidemiology today and about what epidemiology is and how it's done and why it's done. And the purpose of today's tutorial is to give you guys the means by which to then go out and find out about epidemiology of dental diseases specifically, so caries and perio and oral cancer and various other things like that. So I'll just put the presentation on. There we go. So, like I said, what is epidemiology and how to find it and why it's relevant to us as DCPs. But then also we're going to talk about peer review, because the assessment, the portfolio assessment that you have for epidemiology is a peer review and a peer assessment task. So we're going to look at that, and then we'll talk a wee bit more about what that assessment involves and what you need to do, because now after today you've got the information, you need to get on and do it. So, what is epidemiology then? Now, you're probably fairly aware of this already, but there's a various different definitions there, and I've put a couple up there. But I really like this definition at the bottom there by Mausner and Kramer, which says that it's a study concerned with the frequencies of illness and injuries in groups of people, as well as the factors that influence its distribution. So, rather than saying to an individual, you have a high caries risk, say, instead of that, we're going to look at a whole population. Now, when I say population, I don't necessarily mean the population of a country or a city. It's just a group of people. So it could be a group of secondary school students, or it could be the population of Dumfries. Population just means a group of individuals. But we're looking at disease and how it occurs and why it occurs as a whole, rather than these sort of small-scale studies that you see. And often when we're looking at evidence-based dentistry, because that's what epidemiology is, it's evidence-based. But often with evidence-based dentistry, you're looking at smaller studies, sort of randomised controlled trials and things like that. And it may well not be about the disease itself, it may be about looking about things like materials, like the fish sealants ones that we've looked at and things like that. So it's widening it out and giving us information that we can then use at a dental public health level. So if you remember, dental public health is all about educating the masses rather than the individual, and epidemiology is about studying the masses rather than the individual. So, for example, we all know that as a population we're all different height. Very few of us are all exactly the same height, we all vary. But how do I know that for a woman I'm quite tall? Or that my dad, who's 5'5", for a man is quite short? Like, who's decided that? So, if we look at the whole population and worked out what height they all were, then we could get an idea of the population as a whole. And then we can look at the tallest block and the shortest block, and then we have a reason to call these people tall or short. So that's epidemiology. It's giving us boundaries, looking at averages, looking at the extremes, and that type of thing, in a large group of people. And we need it for all sorts of things. I mean, it's evidence-based dentistry, basically. It really helps us establish etiology. A really good epidemiological study will give us a cause and effect link. Not all of them do, and you'll see why when we come on to talk a wee bit more, but it helps us link. There's a really famous study, which some of you might come across when you're doing your research for this assessment, which is the Inuit studies, the Inuit caries studies, and it looked at caries incidents in people who lived in the Arctic Circle over a long period of time, from when there was no westernisation and they lived off seal meat and seabird eggs. And then as it became more and more developed and their diet became more westernised, and all of a sudden they got a lot more caries. And studies like that have allowed us to say, yeah, sugar causes caries. Big scale epidemiological studies. The other thing that it helps us do is to understand incidence, so how often we find a disease, and that can help us make a diagnosis. If we know how common a disease is, we can then decide if it's likely or not whether this patient has that disease. So, for example, if a patient presents with linea alba, we can look at epidemiologicals and say, right, okay, so cheek biting is really, really common. Lichen planus is really not very common. So it's more likely that this patient is just cheek biting rather than having lichen planus. So it can help aid a diagnosis, not give you one, but aid it. They allowed us to educate people, which is fairly straightforward. We're going to be educated about it today, and we can educate the public. Risk assessment. Epidemiology is really important in risk assessment. It's these kind of studies that are identifying these risk factors that we can then put together and make a risk assessment for a patient. And from there, from your risk and your needs assessment, we then target our screening and preventative programs. So we, instead of just saying to everybody, we're going to put fluoride varnish on all your kids, we're going to look at epidemiological studies like NDIP, which is the National Dental Inspection Programme, and say, oh, well, actually, this area is more likely to have caries than that area. So therefore, we'll target our preventative programme to that area. So, we've talked about what epidemiology is. But what makes a study an epidemiological study? And it's basically any study which is there's a large group of people. I'm not sure why I've got this. Here we go. Any which is a large group of people and a cross section of society. We're looking at randomly selected participants. It's not good practice in a epidemiological study to select your participants really from strict criteria, because then you're not getting this cross-section. You're not getting an idea of the society as a whole. You're just looking at what that person who was born on this date and weighs this much and all that kind of stuff goes in. It becomes more individual than epidemiological then. So, for example, the Hopewood House study in Australia in the 1960s observed a group of underprivileged children and their caries rates. So it was a big group of kids. Yes, they all came from the same sort of socioeconomic background, but it was a large group of them. And it looked at how much caries they had. That is a classic epidemiological study. However, the Cochrane review that one of you guys spoke about in the in Journal Club a few weeks ago, that looks at sealants for preventing dental decay in permanent teeth, that's not an epidemiological study. Okay, that's a systematic review. It's a literature review. It's looking at lots of different evidence gathered from lots of different means and drawing conclusions from them. So whilst some of the studies that they look at in that might have an epidemiological basis, it's not an epidemiological study because it's not looking directly at a population. So to go on a wee bit more about what is an epidemiological study, I appreciate there's a lot of text on that slide, and I will put this on Blackboard when I'm finished today and you'll be able to look into it a wee bit more. They come in various different shapes and forms and they all have their advantages and disadvantages. And some are more common than others for various different reasons. So we can initially split it into two different groups. We have descriptive epidemiology and then we have analytical epidemiology. So descriptive, as the name might suggest, is just describing patterns and risk factors in the population group. It's not maybe exploring them and explaining them, it's just telling us about them. It tells us who's affected by disease and where the condition occurs, as well as possibly how often. And these can come in two forms, and often a bit of both, to be honest. We have randomly or routinely collected data. So this is data that we already have. So for example, every examination you do a soft tissue exam. You're not collecting that for epidemiological purposes. You're collecting that for the benefit of the individual. But if we took everybody that you'd seen for the last 2 years and collated all their soft tissue exams, then we're looking at it at an epidemiological level. So routinely collected data is used a lot for epidemiological studies. Even just things like the census. That's one of the reasons why we have a census every 10 years, is so that people can then pick bits of evidence out of it and collate it to give us idea about patterns and risk factors. Birth, deaths and marriages. You have to, by law, register when somebody is born, gets married or dies, because we need to be able to monitor how many people there are. But in doing that, you can then gather that information and turn it into epidemiological data. From a dental perspective, as well as a soft tissue exam, BPEs. We don't collect them so that we can look at how good everybody's perio health is, but it is quite useful for that purpose as well. And DMFT, that I should say, so decayed, missing and filled teeth, is the index that's used commonly, and particularly in deciduous teeth. So, where data has been used for the study that wasn't specifically collected for that reason, we call that routinely collected data epidemiology. If, however, the data has been collected specifically, so surveys have been sent out or examinations have been done for that study, it then becomes a cross-sectional study. So the only difference between those two is why the data was collected in the first place. Cross-sectional studies, although they take more organisation, the data is easier to get a hold of and analyse. When you're looking at routinely collected data, you've often got to sift through literally mountains of information to get the little bits that you need. And particularly if you're looking at data that's old, data from 40, 50 years ago, it can be really difficult. Nowadays, you can probably type into a database and you'll get it. But if you've got paper or printed documentation, that can be a real nightmare. I don't know if any of you have ever done any kind of genealogy, but or even watched programs like Who Do You Think You Are? And the huge documents that they're going through to find one tiny little bit of information. And that's kind of what you end up doing when you're doing epidemiological studies from routinely collected data. Either way, both of these are fairly easy to do. Descriptive epidemiology, fairly easy to do. You're not really needing to go into great depth. You're just getting the information and presenting it. The problem is that it's very hard to establish cause and effect. It's very hard to say that from this data that I've got from the census, there were 100 people lived in this area, and 60 people of those had diabetes. Well, there's nothing to say that's actually linked. Do they have diabetes because of where they live, or do they live where they live because they've got diabetes, or in fact, are they not related at all? Is it just a coincidence? So, from descriptive epidemiology, you can find trends, but it's hard to really make a definitive link between a disease and its etiology. Like, for example, people who are unemployed. People who are unemployed are more likely to have disease. We know that, but what we can't say from that type of figure is, do they have disease because they're unemployed, or are they unemployed because they're not fit to work? And you can't say one or the other, so you need other things to support that. But we still use descriptive epidemiology an awful lot in medicine, and particularly dentistry. All our health surveys that we have, so the adult dental health survey is the yearly, well, I think it's a 3-yearly cycle actually, a study that's done in England and Wales. NDIP is the yearly National Dental Inspection Programme in Scotland, which tells us about the oral health of children. There's also the Scottish Health Survey, which has a dental section. And those are all just either surveys that people fill in or examinations that people have had. And it tells us who they are, like how old they are, where they're from, and what the state of their teeth is. So it shows us trends and distribution, but not necessarily cause. So that's descriptive epidemiology. other side, the other angle that you can go down with epidemiology, which arguably gives you more reliable data, is analytical studies. So rather than just taking data that we have or gathering data and presenting it, it's looking into it and makes conclusions from the data. So these come in a whole different, there's about 4 different sections here, and it's fairly, once you get the terminology in your head, it kind of makes sense as to what they are. So we have observational studies, and as the name suggests, we get conclusions from looking at people, and looking at the population, looking at the practices of that population. We're just watching them in their natural environment and making decisions about it from that. They can be retrospective, so that means looking in the past, and that they're looking at people who have the disease. Or they can be prospective, so looking to the future, and for that you would be looking at people who have high risk to get that disease, and then looking to see whether they get it or not. So if it's retrospective, it's a case-control study, and if it's prospective, they're more often than not called longitudinal studies, because they take a long time. The important thing with observational studies is we don't make any changes. We just let people do what they do anyway, and then we observe it. And you would have a control group. So you'd have, the classic one for this is smoking. You'd have a group of people who smoke, you'd have a group of people who don't smoke, and we're going to observe the 2 of them and see how their disease changes, and with how the smoking then affects that. So your no smoking is your control group. They're completely ethical observational studies, and that's why they're used a lot. It wouldn't be right to take a group of people who don't smoke and say to 10 of them, you have to smoke now, and you have to not smoke, and then we'll make a change, because we know that smoking is bad for people, so you can't make people do it to study them. So they're very ethical, and that's why they're used an awful lot. If you want to do something and make an alteration to somebody's everyday practice, it then becomes an interventional study. And this is where we see things like randomised clinical control trials, where you've got 2 or 3 or 4 groups of people, and you make a change to whatever they do and monitor how that affects their experience of a disease. They're always prospective. That couldn't be retrospective. You couldn't do a randomised clinical control trial and ask people what they did the week before, because then they weren't controlled the week before. So it's always looking ahead. You're going to tell them to do something, and you're going to observe them as they do it. It is the absolute gold standard for saying A causes B, because you've got a group who don't do A and don't get B, and then you've got a group who you make do A and then they get B. Because you've got identical groups, you know, with one factor changed. A really good example of an interventional study, analytical study, is split mouth trials, and they used them a lot for a while to test the effectiveness of things like fissure sealants and fluoride varnish. So you'd have kids and you'd fissure seal half their mouth and leave the other half non-sealed. But obviously the mouth is going to get exactly the same environment in every other way, and you'd see whether they've got caries on one side and not the other. Often the randomised clinical control trials that have gone in the past, you would never be allowed to do them now, because it's really unethical. There's a classic of Vipa Home. I don't know if you've looked at Vipa Home study before, but Vipa Home study was in Sweden or Finland. No, Sweden. Yeah, Vipa Home was Sweden. And it was a institution for people with learning difficulties, special needs, mental health problems. It was what they used to call a sanatorium. And these people were completely unable to consent to be part of this trial at all. And they split them up into all different groups, and they got given copious amounts of sugar, some of them. Others got none, obviously. And then some were given toffees, some were given sugary drinks. And they knew when they did that study that would cause disease. And they also knew that they were doing it on a group of people who had no means by which to say yes or no, I do or don't want to be involved in that. But they were there, and it was a captive audience. So they did it. And that is the basis of an awful lot of our education that we give patients now about sugar and frequency and consistency. But you would never be allowed to repeat that study. It was really, really wrong. We also have, not from a dental perspective, but from a medical perspective, a big group of area of data that was collected in Nazi concentration camps from awful trials that they did to people. And various different countries have chosen whether or not they want to use that information. So these things would never be allowed to be repeated, and that's the problem with modern randomised clinical control trials, is we know so much about what does us harm and does us good, and it's very hard now to conduct a large-scale epidemiological study using an interventional method from an ethical perspective. So observational if you're letting people do what they do anyway, interventional if we're making a change. The next two are less common, but they're there anyway. So community trials is if you're looking at a group of people who are all closely linked. And the classic example I've put there is in a school. So it's very hard to keep them separate and to keep it randomised and keep it controlled, because they're going to talk. So the example I put there is if you're looking at assessing methods of education. If we took you guys and taught half of you in one method and taught half of you in the other, and then asked you, and we looked at your results and saw who did better, we couldn't possibly say that you hadn't spoken to each other in the meantime and helped each other out for the different methods. So you can't randomise it and you can't make it blind. So instead we call it a community trial. You don't have a control, because people share their experiences. They're an acceptable form of study, and sometimes that's all you can do, but you just have to analyse with a wee bit of caution. And just bear in mind there may be similar factors influencing both groups, rather than your classic control group or not. And then the last type are rare, but when they happen, they're really useful. And these are called natural experiments. And this is where something major has happened, an event has happened, and you seize the opportunity to take information from it. So dentally, we have quite a lot of studies into the effects of World War II rationing on caries rates. And we know from those studies that during World War II and for the years afterwards, when sugar was really tightly rationed, the caries rates plummeted. So that was a natural experiment. We didn't cause World War II so that we could watch people's caries rate. So it is observational, but at the same time it's taking advantage of a situation that occurred. We've also got an awful lot of information about radiation and the effects of radiation from the studies that they did as a result of the atomic bombs in Japan. They're really of major importance, natural experiments, but the opportunity doesn't happen very often for them anymore. But when it does, we make the most of it. Tristan da Cunha is another dental related studies. It would be quite nice if one of you could look at Tristan da Cunha for your assessment. Tristan da Cunha is a really cool wee set of islands, which is about as far away from anywhere in the world as it could possibly be. It's right in the middle of the South Atlantic, and they just live in this wee island. And then they all got sent away because there was a volcano that erupted, and they got sent away to different places and they came back. But that was natural experiments that have gone on for the best part of 100 years. So, it's important that you have a rough understanding of what type of study it is that you're looking at from an epidemiological point of view, so that you can think about how valid the results are and how relevant they are to what we're doing. And how you can explain them to people, whether it be patients or whether it be a group of health professionals that you're giving some oral health promotion to, that type of thing. I'm not suggesting that you need to know all the ins and outs, but You can find more information in the Essentials of Dental Public Health textbook, which are the links at the end. You can get it as an ebook on the UHI library, but it's got a wee bit more about various different ones if you want to look a wee bit more into them. And when you come to do your assessment, you need to be able to identify what kind of study it is you're looking at. So, epidemiological data. Where do we get it? There is a possibility that at some point in your career you may well be involved in the gathering of it, but at this stage, the Scottish Public Health Observatory website, which I've linked to there, contains all the Scottish Government gathered epidemiological data. And epidemiological data does tend to be government funded. It's on a huge scale. The funding got to come from somewhere. It's of great interest to the government to understand the health of their nation, so that's why it tends to be funded. So this will give you Scottish studies. You can find on gov.uk, you will find nationwide, well, they call them nationwide, but they're not nationwide. They're England and Wales, and sometimes Northern Ireland as well, because Scottish studies tend to do their own. Sometimes we all link up, but they're usually individual. But from a Scottish point of view, it's all in there. And what you're looking at, you might not be able to see this quite so small, but
just turn out your
the health, yeah, it's fine. The health and wellbeing section has got a lot of the things, and also the one next to it is publications. And sometimes it'll link you out to other websites like NDIP and Health Survey website and stuff. But that is a really good website to find modern and up-to-date information. And it'll generally go, if it's studies that are done yearly, they'll generally go sort of 10 years back worth of information as well. So I just wanted to clarify a couple of terms for when you are looking at data, because sometimes things, prevalence, incidence and rates are three terms that I anyway seem to get a bit, are they all interchangeable and do they all mean the same thing? And they don't. Prevalence and incidence in particular are a wee bit confusing to get your head around, but prevalence is how many people have that disease, have any symptoms, no matter how long it's been going on for, they've got that disease. So that would include, say for example, asthma. That would include everybody who had one wheezy session when they were 3, right up to people who have had asthma all their life and are on a whole lot of medication. So prevalence, a lot of people would say overestimates disease. It'll say more people have got it than they actually have. Incidence is the number of new diagnosed cases. So that'll tell us if it's becoming more common to develop the disease or not. Whereas the prevalence number often just sort of stays the same because the same number of people have the disease. Whereas incidence will tell us, and yet with prevalence, as people drop off one end, they come back on the other end, if that makes sense. You know, as people die off, people are born, so the number tends to move. Whereas incidence will tell us how many people got the disease that year or that decade. And in terms of caries, that's what we're looking at with the MFT. That's a measurement of incidence rather than prevalence. Prevalence would be whether they've got teeth or not. And then the rate is how it changes. So it's sort of how incidence moves to prevalence. Because rates change all the time. Like caries rate, we know that's dynamic, and a patient can go from having a really low caries rate to a really high caries rate and back down the way. So rates changes, and rates depend on risk factors. So it's quite good to understand the difference between those three things when you're looking at epidemiological data. It'll make a lot more sense to you if you can understand that. I don't want to talk too much about indices, but when you come to look at studies, they talk a lot about indices and about what they've been used. But basically an index is just a means by which we measure a disease. And you use indices a lot because you use plaque and bleeding index, BPE is a type of index, DMFT. your index of orthodontic treatment need that we talked about last semester in CD2. So it's just a way of measuring stuff, basically, and a way of deciding, rather than saying, yes, you've got caries or no, you haven't, it's saying you've got this much caries and you've got this much caries. That's all. And sometimes they use indices that make things really complicated. And I do wonder why, but I'm sure there's some fabulous research reasons for it, and nothing to do with the fact that they just want to be different. I just wanted to say a little bit about qualitative data. So usually in epidemiology we're looking at quantitative, numbers, hard figures. This many people had this disease, this many people had this disease, and it's just figures. But some things you can't really get a good understanding of using just figures. Sometimes you need to understand patient experiences or the way they feel about things. So smoking cessation, for example, it's very difficult to put a figure on whether people have tried to stop smoking or not. Because what did you try 50% to stop? Did you try 70%? It's hard to put a figure on that. So sometimes we need to use qualitative data, which is in words. People are explaining it. And we get that from focus groups and from interviews. So from talking to people, basically. Not very often from surveys, because people, and you'll all have done it when you filled in a paper survey or an online survey, you tick the questions that have a yes or no or a number, and the ones that say write something in this box, everybody just skips them. So they tend not to use surveys. And it gives us a snapshot of how those people feel at that particular time. However, the problem with qualitative data is how those people feel at that particular time could be very different to how a different group of people feel at a different group of time, a different part of time. So they say that it's hard to generalise qualitative data. But you will come across it sometimes, and some studies will have a qualitative section. It's usually to add to quantitative. So maybe they've done their quantitative study about how many people have stopped smoking and how many people haven't, and then they want to know why. So then you'll get a qualitative bit afterwards. Or they've done a qualitative bit first and then gone into it more as quantitative. It's rare that you will find a fully qualitative epidemiological study, because it doesn't give you the information you need. It's also incredibly expensive and very difficult to do in a large scale. You can't have a focus group with 6,000 people in it. It just wouldn't work. So qualitative is not as common. In fact, it's quite rare, but it does have its uses. So why am I telling you about all this? We need to know it. We need to know what epidemiology is and how it's done and why it's done. And its relevance. Because it's our evidence base. All comes back to this evidence-based dentistry, and when I put at the start the list of the reasons why we do it. The other thing that we can do in epidemiology is be part of it. Be part of the team that gathers the information, be part of the team that analyse it. This is not just the work of dentists. In fact, I would argue it's not the work of dentists at all. It's not a good use of their time. It's also not just the remit of dental public health experts. A couple of years ago, they decided that the NDIP examinations could be done by therapists, and they trained us to do them, which was interesting because it was before the direct access chat. So when you go out and you do NDIP studies, you go to all the schools and you have a proportion of the population that you're looking to see. And it depends where you are, because in Glasgow, there's so many kids, they'll maybe go to a school and see 100 kids at each school. Whereas here, you're lucky if you find 100 kids in a school, so you just do them all because it's easier. If you're going to go to a school that's got 20 pupils, you might as well look at them all. But anyway, you go to a school, you get however many kids that you're going to see, they all lie down on just tables, You take a yoga mat type thing with you, and they lie down on there. You look in their mouths and you say, that tooth has caries, that doesn't, that does, that doesn't, and blah, blah, blah. And you're just looking. You're not doing any treatment or anything like that. And then we'd been saying for years, why are dentists going out and do this? Like, this is a really good role for therapists in community and in salaried services. And they're like, aye, well, it probably is. So they all sent us on this course, and it was great, and they showed us it's very, very specific. You can't just say, I think there's caries. You have to stick with this criteria because there's so many different people measuring it. So you've got to stick on this criteria. So we all went and did this, and we all calibrated brilliantly and said it's a great success. And then somebody, somewhere, probably in the GDC, piped up, but therapists can't diagnose caries because it was before direct access. And we all went, but we just did. Like, that's what we spent the last 2 days doing, and it worked really well. And there was over 100 of us there, so it wasn't just the odd few. We all did it well. Yeah, but you can't do it because you can't diagnose caries. It was like head against a brick wall. But then direct access happened and it was fine. So now there's quite a lot of therapists go out and do that. So it's a different part of your job, and it's unlikely to be your whole job, and that's all you do all the time. But it's a different thing to do, and if you work in community or in salaried services, it's something you might well get the opportunity to do. You may also choose to go and work for take a research post at maybe one of the dental hospitals or whatever, and epidemiology is quite likely to be a big part of that. So it's not just something that other people do and we read. We can do it, and we can be a big part of it if you're that way inclined. Personally, spending 3 days dealing with primary 1 children lying on tables made me feel unwell. But I did it. And I would do it up here because you'd really just spend like most of the day just driving around and going to all the really cute little schools. Okay. It's primary 1s and primary 7s that you do in NDIP, but there's lots of different studies. So it's very relevant, and I don't really think I need to go through those because it's really what we've talked about the whole way along. But it's the evidence base for what we do, and without big cross-sectional studies, both present and historical, we wouldn't be able to provide the care that we provide. If nobody had ever looked at why people who lived in Colorado had better teeth than people that lived in the state next door, we would never have known that it was because of the fluoride that was naturally in the water in Colorado. So they tend to give us the initial basis. From them we then go on to do more specific individual studies. So before I move on to assessment, is everybody happy with what we've talked about so far? About what epidemiology is and why we do it and how we do it? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay then. So the assessment for this is part of your portfolio. It's 20% of your portfolio. And it's a peer review and assessment task. The process of doing this assessment is going to teach you all, you're all going to teach each other the learning outcomes for this section of the module. Okay? Wait a minute, you're looking at me scared there, Kerry. It'll make sense in a minute. Because what I want you all to do now is to go and find an epidemiological study and teach the rest of the class about it. Okay? And in a minute, I've given you topics so that you're not all going to end up with exactly the same study, because otherwise you'll all do NDIP because it's easy. So you've all got different topics. You're going to be asked to find an epidemiological study and present your findings to the group about that study. I'm not asking you to do a critical analysis of the paper. Yeah? I'm not wanting you to do what you do for Journal Club. This is quite different. I want you to read a paper and get information from it, learn from it, and then tell the rest of the group. And I'm going to do one for you in a bit, as you all know, because I put it on as SDL, so you'll see what I mean a wee bit. Now, in the process of doing this, you're going to work with two of your student colleagues. I'm going to say we'll do this anonymously. If you want to take it amongst yourselves to find out who you all are, that's fine. I'm only making it anonymous because research suggests that people prefer it that way. But you can probably work it out amongst yourselves if you want. It doesn't matter. But basically, you're going to find your paper and you're going to do a bit of research and you're going to get what you get from it. And then two of your peers are going to have a look at it and give you some feedback on where you are at that stage. And then you'll get a wee bit longer to work on it using that feedback before you present it to the class. And then when you present it to the class, you're all going to give each other a mark. I'll then average those marks, and that is the mark you will get. I'm not going to give you a mark for this. You're going to mark each other. Because you're teaching each other. I'm not teaching you this, you're teaching each other. So you should give each other the credit, or not, as the case may be, for what they've taught you. So the marking criteria that I put on Blackboard, that you're going to use to peer review me in a minute, is the marking criteria that we use on the day. So it looks at how good the study is, whether you think it's an epidemiological study and if it's any good, about hierarchy of evidence, how well the other person has read and understood that study, and how they've related it to what we do. And you can use this when you're providing your feedback to your colleagues, and you'll also use this on the day to mark each other. So the best way to do that is if you have one of these. So on the day you're going to have 13 copies of these, and you're just going to write whoever it is on the top and mark them as such. And the boxes help you get an idea of whether you think it is basically excellent, good, satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And you can, from there, come up with an overall mark. So the reason why we're using peer review and peer assessment is because it's a really good way of learning. It's not about, assessment doesn't just have to be about you telling us what you know. You should learn from doing an assessment. And this is the point of this, you're all going to learn from each other. And there's been a whole load of research done as to the reasons why it's good. But the things that I think are most valuable is that what you learn from each other is really valuable because you're all in that same boat. And you guys understand where you are and how you're feeling at this stage and what you need to know. So it's a really valuable information that you get from each other. If you have to mark the work of somebody who's your colleague or your peer, you're going to make sure that you know it well enough to mark it in the first place. Or you should. That's a sort of a moral thing that most of us have. Okay, you're not going to mark someone on something that you've not done any work for, because you're just like, oh, I'll just give you a random mark. It's not fair, and you wouldn't want that to be treated. Can you imagine if I got all your assessment, your portfolios in, and I went, I don't really know about that topic. Ugh, I'll give 6. You'd be raging, and rightly so. So you have a sort of responsibility to each other. And then you learn at a much deeper level, rather than just me spouting a load of information to you and it going in one ear and it staying long enough for an exam and then it disappearing. And you do it all the time. You do. I'm sure quite regularly you say to one of the people in your class, can you look at this for me? I'm not sure if I've got this right. Can you help me with this? Can you proofread this? All that type of stuff. It's no different to that. Like with your audits, I'm sure a lot of you have said to you, how have you done that? Let me see how you've done it. So, that makes more sense now. You're doing it anyway. It's just making it more formal. You should get credit for what you're doing anyway. So, what I'm going to do for you, because I appreciate that from a student's perspective, this might just look like I can't be bothered doing your marking. So I've just given it to you to do, and it's really not like that at all, and I promise that. Obviously, I've done this explanation of what peer assessment is and given you your guidelines. Um, your marking criteria is really important because you've all got the same marking criteria, so you're all marking from the same standard. So we've spent a long time developing this marking criteria, and if there's anything that you don't understand about it at all, just drop me an email and I can explain it a wee bit more. But what I don't have is influence on the final mark, unless, of course, I'm going to be there, right? When you do your presentations, I'm going to be there. And if I think somebody's been particularly hard done by when I get the marks in, then I do reserve the right to, do something about that. I've never had to do that. I've been doing peer assessment in various forms for a long time now, and I've never ever had to step in and say that's unfair. So I take overall responsibility for the marks that are awarded, but I don't really have any influence on them. It's you guys. And it works well because it's a big class and you're going to get the average mark of what everybody's given you. So if somebody's just really mean, then it's okay because it'll average out. So timeline-wise, how this is going to work. Today, we're going to do this peer review example. You've got the marking criteria, and I'm going to give you the topics that you're working on. Then you've got 2 weeks until the 9th of April, so 2 weeks over the Easter break, to find your paper or your study and present your rough workings on it, okay? This is what you're going to get your feedback from. It doesn't need to be your final presentation. It could be notes, what you've taken from what you've read, that type of stuff. So by lunchtime on Thursday the 9th of April, I need you all to email that to me, and then I will distribute it out. So you will all receive 2 pieces of work to peer review. All right, does that make sense?
It won't be the final piece.
No,
it's
drafts, okay? So you're going to look at that and say, this bit's really good, or that bit needs, are you sure you're understanding this bit, type thing. Like, well, you'll need to write it some way, so because I need to then give it back to the student, to whoever it belongs to. All right. However you do it, you could do a voice file if you wanted. If you find that easier, but
your draft of work, do you need to do like a Word document?
Yeah, because it's going to need to be sent to people.
Right. Okay.
You can do it however you want. A Word document. You could do a voice file. You could do a wee video. You could just whatever. But you need to have. You're not just sending the paper to somebody to peer review. You're sending your understanding of it. All right. So on Thursday, I will get them all, and then I'll send them all out. And you've then got a week to provide the feedback and send it back to me. And then I'll send it back to whoever it belongs to. And then you've got another week to use that feedback that you've got from your peers to get your final draft of your presentation. And then on Thursday the 23rd, which is what's on the timetable, we'll do the presentations. Okay? Is that clear? So every single one of you will be doing a presentation and peer reviewing 2 others. And then on the day, you will mark everybody's. You will all mark all 13. Well, 12, because you're one of them. And you're not going to mark your own. That's self-assessment, which is different again. So here's your topics. This is totally random. Kerry, Laura, Flora and Shannon, you're going to look, and this is individually, by the way. You're not working as a group, it's individually. You need to find an epidemiological study about caries. Jill, Rufine and Sonia, you need to find one about periodontal disease. Wilma, Danielle and Katie have got oral cancer. And in the other category, we have Mariana, Jyoti and Karen. For other, I need you to go, in fact I can do it here. If you go on to Blackboard and find the aims and learning outcomes for the session, there's, if I can remember these off the top of my head, the link between diabetes and perio, the non-carious tooth surface loss, so epidemiology about that, so about erosion and attrition, all that kind of stuff. The link between oral health and cardiovascular disease, and there's one other. Obesity, I think. But either way, none of these are obscure. I haven't set you anything really obscure. And it might seem a bit unfair that the people on caries is easier than people doing other, but in actual fact you'll find it's a wee bit more difficult to find studies about caries than it is about the other ones. So it all works out sort of evenly across the board in the end. All right.
So we find that on Blackboard on aims and learning outcomes, did you say?
Yeah. I'll show you actually. Well, I might as well. So just so that I'm not making it unclear. Let's do Explorer.
Sure.
Right then, so if we go to dental public health, and then in module information is not your aims and learning outcomes. Oh yes, it is. Lecture schedule and learning outcomes. There we go. So it's that session there that you're looking for, 2.5.7.5, other oral epidemiology. There we go. So, yeah, non-carious tooth surface loss and its etiological factors. The link between diabetes and periodontal disease. The link between oral and cardiovascular disease. And, oh, it's this one. The link between periodontal disease and other chronic inflammatory conditions, such as rheumatoid arthritis, but it could also be other general chronic inflammatory conditions like asthma or Crohn's disease or things like that. And if one of you happens to find another topic that isn't one of those, as long as it's something to do with oral disease and something else, I would be quite happy for you to use that as well. If you're unsure, any of you are in that others category, just let me know. All right. I'm not going to advise you on the selection of the study itself because that's what your colleagues are going to mark you on. But if it's just the topic, then please just give me a shout and I can help you with that.
So we're like all splitting in. So we're splitting up doing.
You're splitting up. If I go back to the start of this, the four sessions. So 4 of you are on caries, 3 perio, 3 oral cancer, and 3 on other. And they are the lectures that you're teaching each other. All right. It's only happened that you've got 4 of you on caries because it's not an even number. I haven't quite worked out how I'm going to make sure you all get even number distributed, but I'm sure I can work it out somehow. All right. Any questions on the assessment and what you need to do? Well, that's good. Sorry?
When will this happen? You'll just after this lecture?
Yeah, I'll put it on as soon as we're finished. Okay, I just didn't finish writing it until yesterday, so that's why it didn't go up yet.
No, that's okay.
So, to help you, I've put some references, and you will see I've pointed big red arrows at the Essentials of Dental Public Health, section 2, which is page 65 to 119. Not only will that help you understand a wee bit more about the process of epidemiology that we've talked about already, you may well also find good suggestions for studies to look at. You don't need to spend hours raking Google Scholar and PubMed for ideas on what paper to look at. There are very, very famous studies that you can look at. So, part 2
paper.
doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't matter if you use the same paper because you may well look at it differently. So you can use that section of that book to help guide you if you want on studies that you might want to cover. All right. So that's why I pointed big huge arrows at it, because it's really good, really, really useful, and it explains things really well. And it is available in ebook, so if you've not got in the library, you can get it online. Right then. So what I want to do now is I'm going to present the paper the study that I gave you for SDL, which is a totally random study that I found linking caries to watching TV, which amused me a little bit in its title, and that's why I picked it. But so what I'm doing here is exactly what you're being asked to do, and the only difference being is obviously I haven't had the opportunity to get the feedback that you guys are going to get before this. So I would expect you guys to come out with a better presentation, to be honest. But I've had the marking criteria that you've all got. That's the other great thing about peer assessing. In theory, because you've got the answer plan, you should be able to produce an amazing presentation, really. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes, which is how long you guys will have. Okay, for your presentation, I should have said that start. You've got 10 minutes, 15-minute slots in order to get you all in on the day, and there does need to be time for questioning, so 10 minutes for each presentation. All right. So I'm aiming to spend about 10 minutes on this, although I haven't actually run through it, but I think it'll be okay. I will keep an eye on the clock. I want you all to give me a mark and scribble on this if you've got any feedback, any reasons for it. The easiest way to use a rubric I find, which is what this is, this marking scheme is a rubric, is if I put it on the screen, I'll show you what I do when I'm marking. Where did I put it? Peer review task rubric. Personally, I would use the highlighter, but you just whatever. And I would just, as you were talking or as I was reading what work you were doing, I would say, right, yeah, do you know what that... Oh. Right. Yeah, that's... Oh, I haven't put that on the screen, sorry. I'm just looking at my screen. So this is the rubric. I understand you can't read it because it's too small there, but I would just sort of underline and be like, yeah, and I've done that bit, but then, hang on, for that section it's more in that bit, so maybe I'll give 4 marks. And I would write it in there. Or sometimes it's really clear, and sometimes you're like, no, do you know what? They've absolutely done what I want them to do there, so let's give them the 10, or the other end. But normally, you'll have a couple of things circled or underlined in each box, and then you can sort of weight it out and go, probably 6 overall. All right. That's how I find rubrics useful to use, and then when you get to the end, obviously you're just going to add up. But you can do it whatever way you want, really. So I'm going to do this. I want you to give me a mark, and in this circumstance, I'm going to ask you just to tell me afterwards. But for your actual assessment, you won't know what you were given by different people. The marks will come to me, I'll average it, and that's the mark you'll get. So, that's to try and make you feel a bit more comfortable, so you don't feel like, oh, I can't give her that because she's my friend, and if she knows I've done that, then she might get annoyed with me. There's none of that, because you won't know what you've given each other. Right then. Okay, so the paper I've chosen to present is a study that was carried out in Guangxi, I think, in China, and it was aiming to provide a link between the incidence of dental caries in young people in China and how much television they were watching. So it looked at, the age group was the 12 to 17-year-olds, and all in all, they used 3,568 participants. Now, initially, they got the first lot of data from a national survey, which was the 2010 National Physical Fitness and Health Surveillance, which is a yearly survey that's done and looks into all the children and adolescents within China. So that was people up to the age of 17. And they got their initial data from that study. So that was an observational study, and it was descriptive, routinely collected data. And the authors of this study used that data to then pinpoint the subjects that they wanted to use for their own study. So they decided to limit it to one area, the Guangxi area of China, and that was where the 3,568 participants came from. Those people were then approached to take part in the study. They were sent a survey to ask them about how much television they watched and other sort of physical activities that they were involved in. And they were also given a dental examination that would show us how much caries they had. So that then took the descriptive, routinely collected data to a more analytic role. It was observational, but there was no intervention. The children were not advised on how much TV they should and shouldn't be watching. They were just asked about what their current practices were. Therefore, there was no control group. There was no group where, say, for example, the children, none of them watched television. Because there's no control group, it could be argued that it's not particularly high on the hierarchy of evidence. It would probably be about a moderate sort of level. But I still think it's useful as epidemiological data goes. So the results of the study, to summarise, basically said that those who watched less than 30 minutes television a day had substantially less caries than everybody else did in the study. Once they were watching over 30 minutes, more than 30 minutes a day, the difference became minimal between how much caries they had. It was the people who hardly watched any television versus the people who watched a lot more that had a lot more caries. And even after they made alterations for socioeconomic status, they still found that the children watching more TV had a lot more caries. It's very difficult to talk about cause and effect with this study because we know that it's not actually the television that's causing their caries. It's the factors that are associated socially with that. So the paper talks a lot in the discussion about the influence of advertising on the children. They found a study by Rod and Patel in the discussion that said that 34% of the adverts on kids' television were for food. And of that 34%, 95% were for highly calorific and highly cariogenic foods. Therefore, the authors have made a link that the reason why the children who watched more television got more caries was because they were influenced by the advertising that they were seeing. Personally, I think there's probably other links involved. If we look at studies like our Adult Dental Health Survey, our Scottish Health Survey, NDIP, and various other census information that looks at physical activity and health, we can see that there's a distinct link. People who live a more sedentary lifestyle experience a lot more disease. And I would have thought, it surprised me quite a lot in the study that they didn't really link. They looked very much at the advertising and not so much at the you're sitting about. And we all know when we sit and watch telly, you've probably got like a bag of crisps and a can of juice and maybe some sweeties. And if you're doing that for prolonged periods every day, then you can see why caries might be more of an issue. But this study very much links it to advertising. And I think we can probably put that down to the fact that it is a very recent study. It's 2000, or it was published in 2014. Excuse me. The data is from the 2010 survey. But if we look at the cultural differences between a rapidly developing country like China and a reasonably already developed country like the UK. Electronic entertainment is particularly influential in rapidly developing countries. If you think about when they were talking about the amount of advertising for food on the kids' channels, you're not actually allowed to do that in this country. The advertising during children's TV programmes is really limited to promoting a healthier lifestyle. So whether how relevant the influence of advertising, food advertising to us and our practice would be is a wee bit more difficult to comment on, because our advertising is very different. But I certainly think there could be a link between the lack of activity and the development of caries. But even in this country, we know that kids today are massively reliant on electronic entertainment. This was just looking at TV, but you could also be looking at things like tablets, computers. You'll get just as much advertising from that point of view as you would on the television, unless, of course, you're watching BBC. So I think it's very relevant. It also ties in really neatly with other national health campaigns, things like Fit for Life, that's trying to encourage kids to get up and out and do stuff rather than sit in front of the television. So it's nice to be able to link that with the dental thing as well. It's looking at a patient really holistically and saying, you've got more caries and you're maybe not very active in your lifestyle either, and those two things are linked. So it's nice to have something that provides us with that kind of information. There are other surveys, epidemiological data that exists that already links obesity with caries. So now we're adding in the inactivity as well. The only thing I could say about this is it might be quite difficult to tackle this with a patient, I did wonder. I don't know how comfortable I would feel to say to a parent, your child has decay, maybe they're watching too much TV. It could very much be seen as, well, that's not your job to tell me how much television my child watches. Although I would probably feel more comfortable saying it to a 16-year-old directly than I maybe would to a parent. But data like this is showing us that there is a link between the television activity and our ability to have that discussion with people. But it might make it a wee bit more difficult. So overall, I found this paper really interesting, hence why I picked it. Initially, the title amused me because I thought, what are they going to say, that there's some kind of radio waves coming through the telly that's giving them decay? Obviously, it didn't say that. It gave very sensible suggestions. And given that I have particular interest in treating people in this sort of adolescence age group and managing their behaviour as well, that's why I thought it would be quite useful and relevant to the practice that I have as a therapist. Would anybody like to ask any questions? No?
Okay, I've got a question. Ms. Hall, did you feel that there was any unethical carrying on in this study?
No, I don't, because it was observational rather than interventional. So the people who did the study didn't change what these kids were doing on a day-to-day basis. It's what they did anyway. They just asked them to report on it, and they obviously gathered data with their examinations as well. So no, I don't think there would be any unethical considerations for this study at all. Anyone else?
I haven't even checked what it was. Has it changed your practice in any way?
The opportunity hasn't arisen yet. Like I said, I'm not sure how comfortable I would feel saying to a patient, stop watching telly because it's giving you decay. But it certainly backs up other evidence that I'm already aware of about a healthy lifestyle and a good holistic way of life. So I would say it's more cementing a practice that I already have rather than making dramatic changes to it.
Miss Hall, in the paper it said that about 50% of the adverts were related to sort of the carcinogenic foods in that. I just wondered, in the paper it doesn't really say how they assessed that, whether they were watching the kids while they were watching TV, or like, you know, how they recorded, how they got that information.
Yeah.
I thought it does have all the numbers. Do you feel that that's a lack in the paper?
Well, I
Not
think...
like explaining how they found it.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. In the discussion, it talks about another paper, this study that was done by Rod and Patel, and that was where they got some of the figures from that said 30% of the adverts were related to food and 95% of those were deemed carcinogenic. So, yeah, they haven't found that information out themselves specifically, but they have gone to another source to find that. I mean, that would have probably made made it a different study if they'd have looked into that as well. Now, off the top of my head, I can't quite remember how the age of that other study. Let me just see. It was 13. 2005. So, I mean, that study that said about the advertising was 2005, and the information was gathered after 2010. So things could have actually changed a bit in that time. Maybe new legislation could have come in or something. So, yeah, it's a valid point that perhaps the information they have about the advertising isn't as specific as it needs to be if they're going to make that kind of conclusion from it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? No? Cool. They were good questions. I like them. Well, I didn't like answering them, but they were well-formed questions. Right. I want to know how you scored me then. You can have a couple of minutes if you want to, if you need to write anything down. I'm going to ask you all, so you might as well just tell me. I'm going to write this down because I want to know. Right. And I'll give myself an average mark at the end, which is what you'll all get. In fact, I've got 13 marks to get, so... Right. Who wants to condemn me first?
Right, start on 22.
Okay.
22 from Jill. 22 from Wilma. 21.
Okay.
21. 21. 22.
Okay.
13.
Okay.
I thought it was a weird study. I just don't see how you can relate it to what you do in the clinic.
Okay. No, fair enough. Jyoti?
I gave it 20.
Okay.
Maybe it was a bit hard.
No, hang on a wee minute. I'll come back to you. Karen?
23.
Rafine?
Oh no.
20.
And Laura?
24.
Okay. Right. That is a really interesting set of figures. And one of the things I wanted you to see from me doing this was that with the right marking scheme, bar the odds curveball, you almost always all come up with a very similar mark. Okay. So that's to reassure you that when you come to do this for each other, you know, there might just be a wee curveball. So you, just out of interest, Kerry, what sort of mark did you give for each section?
Okay, oh no, actually, you got 14. I had 4 for the first.
Okay.
Because it looked into, obviously, decaying caves and things like that. 6 for the second.
Okay.
So basic understanding. I just thought it was a weird study.
Okay.
Like, and I don't know. I feel really bad now.
No, don't feel bad, because this is what we learn from each other. It was a bit of a strange one.
Okay.
It was a bit of a curveball. I just saw it and I thought it made me giggle a wee bit, but also it was a bit different. I didn't want to pick a really, really obvious one that you guys might want to use, but I think it's a
Maybe
fair point.
It was maybe the last marks
But making it relevant.
Yeah.
Okay.
I said that I don't know if you can apply their findings to your practice in clinic.
Okay. I think from that point of view, it
wasn't
probably...
the presentation, it was more the paper.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. At no point in this marking criteria have I asked you to mark each other on your abilities to present, because that's not really relevant. You know, some people are better at talking than others. That's irrelevant. It's about the work that you've done. I would say probably that your thought process is more along the lines of the selection of the study would be a lower mark. So of the first part, and the other two, where your marks come from. I mean, if you thought that was a really rubbish study,
No,
well,
not rubbish,
but not relevant. So maybe it wasn't a good one to
I
pick.
wasn't sure how you could apply their findings into your clinical practice.
And that's okay. That's why no matter what assessment you do, it's at least double marked. And this will be marked 12 times over. Because you do get some people that have a totally different opinion, and that's all right. But because you've got so many marks there, by the time we averaged it out, in fact, I'll do that, because it'll show you what I'll probably come out with about 20, I'd have thought, or 21.
I'll be that other person that's lowered the mark.
But that's why averages work. I'm just working out my average mark in case you think I've disappeared. I have to use a calculator. 2, 5, divided by 12. 21. Okay, so yeah, you gave me 14, but it didn't matter. I've still come out with actually the grade that across the board most people gave me. All right. So hopefully you are clear about what you need to do. If you come up with any other questions, you can always just give me a shout. I am off next week. I'm off tomorrow for a week. So you might not get a reply like instantly, but I will get back to you. And there's the rest of the week before you need to submit your initial first bit for your feedback. And that would be the great advantage of the feedback part that we haven't done today. Is because if you had that kind of thought process, Kerry, you could say in the feedback, are you sure this is the kind of study you want to do? But because you're going to get feedback from two people, you're going to see two different perspectives. So you might have come back to me and said, that paper's rubbish. I don't think you should use it. But Laura might have come back to me and said, oh no, I really like that. And then I could have made a decision from that as to what best to do with it. Okay? Is everything clear?
I was just wondering, so we can pick any epidemiological study, like you mentioned, like the ones that are from like sort of natural disasters, or ones where there's like intervention or just observation. It could be any.
But you have to be able to explain it to your topic.
Yeah, we can't explain it. And we could pick any one, like it's not specific.
Absolutely. Any study that you feel is an epidemiological study.
Yeah, and because we've went over all the different kinds, we don't need to like show that we know what everyone is in our talk.
No, you need to explain the one you're doing. Yeah. No, I'm not looking you to say the other types available are. You just need to look at your study and be able to explain what that is. Okay. And just think about the time slots that you've got, because you have got 10 minutes, and you need to be covering the three sections of the marking criteria in that 10 minutes. Right? Because if you just go over, we'll be here for like all day. We'll probably have to start at 1 o'clock rather than 1:30 to fit you all in anyway. So just be aware of your timings. All right?
Well done, that was really good. Yeah, that was good. Really good.
Thank you.
I've taken notes on it for my one.
That's grand. I hope you put a wee bit more preparation into it than I did, because I've been a bit busy, but Anyway, so just a wee reminder, your audits are due in tomorrow by 5 o'clock. Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 done, written up on Mahara by 5 o'clock tomorrow. Like I said, I am off, but I will check Mahara at 5 o'clock whilst I'm sipping a glass of wine somewhere, just to make sure they're all in. And I'm sure they will be. Please don't all leave it till 4:45 to submit them, because then if something happens to the website, and then everybody has panic. So please, although I know some of you are in already, which is great. The other thing I just wanted to remind you was the SEL that was last week about special needs. Some of you are still to comment on the discussion board about that. So if you haven't already commented, I would appreciate if you could, please.
How long are you keeping that up for? Sorry, because I'm one of the people that hasn't.
I'll leave it up, it's fine. I'll leave it on for over Easter, but I'd like everybody to take some time over Easter to do it, please.
I'll find it.
Alright, cool. Well, if that's everybody happy, then let's finish. And go away and enjoy the sunshine. Have a nice holidays, guys. Bye.
You too.